Now live. Cool. Yeah. All right. I think we are now 100% live. And we have the stream up, and we have Discord up. I don't actually think I want Discord in this picture just yet. Let's grab one of you and a YouTube. A YouTube for everyone. Set up screen. Go. Okay. Doesn't actually look like I'm live. Does it look like I'm? Ah, there we go. It is. It does look like I'm live. Let's grab.
I got the notification saying we're live. I checked.
All right. Yep. Looks like we're live. Cool. Hello. We'll wait a little bit for people to start drifting in. But yeah. Cool. We are live-aroo. Live with you. Got the live. Okay, time to cue soundtrack.
Hey everyone.
Oh yeah, we definitely need to cue the soundtrack. Not only am I seen, I think I'm even heard. I feel listened to, and that means that there's only one thing that can happen next. Do. It's time to sing a little song and wait for people to trickle in. It's cryptography time with Thor and Chloe. Uncloak cryptography. We don't sing in key. We just want to learn cryptography. Bum. What is a key? It's something
I
used
don't
in
know.
cryptography, but not our music. It could not be. We'll move around and sharp that note. It doesn't matter because it's gonna float. Something software. Good morning. Do.
Bum, 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 bum.
Yeah, the
Bum.
secret alpha leak, the Uncloak final is a rap battle, so if you're not ready to spit at least this level of cryptography, singing, and or rapping, good luck. Yeah, I don't think I'd be a particularly difficult rap battle opponent, given my demonstration.
No, probably not. That means everyone can get involved. Low barrier to
Yeah.
entry. So,
Yeah. I suppose like I'm like the shonen tournament sort of format where there's the first guy in the first round and his entire thing is he has one gimmick and then it goes down and dies like really instantly or loses the tournament really instantly. I don't know if the format makes sense at all. This entirely offhand reference. I'm the rap battle tournament opponent in the first round that goes down really quickly after like you just figure out that he sucks. Yeah, that's my rap battle skill. But when it comes to cryptography, maybe I'd have slightly more to say.
okay, so we'll start with a rap battle tournament, and then we'll do a cryptography tournament so you can redeem yourself. It's all fair.
Yeah. I'll just slip into the void. Mom spaghetti. Yeah, mom spaghetti. I forget what comes after that.
Some vomit somewhere, maybe on your sweater.
Vomit on a sweater. Mom spaghetti. Yeah, it has been a couple of minutes since I listened to that song, so I don't remember all the lyrics off the top of my head. Yeah. Okay, so we're probably good to get going here in just a second now. So yeah, today we are going to be talking about, let's check that out. Let's talk about hash functions and MACs. Yeah, he's nervous. Yeah, that's right. All right, yeah. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about. I actually lied. We're going to be talking a little bit about authenticated encryption and GCM mode and a poly. What is that? Cha-cha poly, which is a great name for your upcoming band. In case you were thinking about band names, I strongly recommend Cha-cha poly. Okay, so I prepared something slightly different today, a couple of written notes, and if these are good, tell me that. If they're too hard to read and not good, also tell me that. That'd be useful feedback. But basically just sort of as a quick review of topics from last week, we're covering authenticated encryption. We're only going to talk about authenticated encryption for maybe the first half of the lecture. I want to get into the second half of the lecture where we talk about what we're going to be doing for the next several weeks. There will not be a session on the 23rd of December, but there will be one on the 30th of December. And to sort of somewhat compensate for that, there is a hefty sort of link base in the Uncloak Course 5 notes that is there for you to play around with and give a scroll. Chapter what are we doing? What are we even on? Chapter 8, like Chapter 7 and Chapter 8, both of these chapters in the book are sort of like questionable relevance for, I think, most of the engineers in this audience. So I've been doing my best to sort of mitigate for that with some additional reading material. So, to delay no longer, we start off with basically we were talking about authenticated encryption this week. And so authenticated encryption is sort of like this primitive in cryptography that it's not really a primitive, it's just like mashing together MACs and encryption schemes was not entirely successful as a sort of like primitive, and like there were a lot of vulnerabilities even with the experts who should have known how to do cryptography implementations, the folks who wrote SSL, and that was Netscape's cryptography library that turned into the cryptography library that the entire internet used. There's actually some interesting naming trivia, basically because Microsoft was like, why does this startup control how we name stuff? The IETF said, well, okay, so we'll use their library, we'll rename it from SSL to TLS. So block ciphers kind of get some attention because even the supposed cryptography engineering experts were kind of struggling to glue together the primitive of MAC, message authentication, and block ciphers. So after kind of a spate of preventable vulnerabilities, the sort of like primitive of authenticated encryption started getting discussed more around the mid-2000s, in particular around like 2007. And it's around that time that GCM, the AES GCM mode, which is this primitive in AES that does both message authentication and encryption, gets included. And to sort of scroll back up here just a second, there are several ways that you can compose an MAC and a block cipher, or a stream cipher more precisely. Both of the MAC, or both of the authenticated encryption schemes that we're going to talk about today are sort of in the encrypt then MAC section. And there's a reason for that. And it turns out that if your MAC is on the outside, that is like you get the MAC directly on the receiving party's end, you don't have to decrypt and then authenticate, which means that there's one more step than if you could just authenticate the ciphertext. And this is actually really important when you're thinking about things like DDoS protection. If you only have to do one step as opposed to two cryptographic steps in authenticating a message, then you're obviously going to be more cryptographic, or you're going to be more resistant to attacks, DDoS attacks on your system. So block ciphers and tags were composed by experts even in these vulnerable ways. So the question is, okay, so if it's actually it turns out a little bit difficult to glue together these two primitives, these block ciphers or these stream ciphers and these tags, what can we do instead? Well, the answer was authenticated encryption. And basically two new modes were introduced over the course of 2007 to 2015. Cha-Cha 20 was around when AES GCM mode was standardized. But the real push for Cha-Cha 20 Poly 1305 was a couple of different things. One was that there was only one standard for authenticated encryption for several years, for I think roughly 7 years. And it's a thing that we'll cover a little bit in the latter half of the lecture. When you only have one standard, and that standard bears the entire load, like you don't have anything that's obvious that you could switch to if say, the standard broke. So a lot of the time, the best practice for standards organizations is that they'll try to say, well, we'll standardize at least one, and preferably two different standard algorithms, so that if it turns out that one of them breaks unexpectedly, that some cryptography breakthrough is discovered, we can switch to the other. And this is generally referred to as cryptographic agility by particularly like large corporate organizations. They say, oh, we have cryptographic agility, which really just means that like they designed their APIs to not be awful. But that's what cryptographic agility means, is that you can switch between algorithms if you need to. And as a standards board, Cha-Cha 20 Poly 1305 had some attractive qualities. One of them is that, so AES is standard enough that there are chips specifically for computing AES on many machines, but cell phones were not one of them, at least not for the initial release of like the iPhone and so on. I'm actually not sure if they have chips for computing AES now. In cell phones. But if you don't have these special chips for computing AES is pretty slow relative to some other stuff that you could do. And so basically to speed up the rate at which cell phones could do internet stuff, Google proposed a successor to HTTP1, which was called Speedy. And Speedy relied on Cha-Cha 20, Poly 1305. And so I think HTTP 1.1 dates back to like around 1999 or 2000. I'd have to check on that. But HTTP 2 comes along and is standardized by the IETF around 2015. And that, along with HTTP 2, which deprecated Speedy, is basically an acceptance that Cha-Cha 20 is a good authenticated encryption algorithm. And as I mentioned before, like there was emphasis that there needed to be at least one other like standard authenticated encryption algorithm. So Cha-Cha 20 came along. And I am somewhat skimming over GCM mode. And I don't intend to discuss it in any detail in this lecture. Because Cha-Cha 20 is now at least as popular or at least as commonly used as GCM mode, and is also typically faster. So it tends to be the choice that people go with nowadays. It's standard in HTTP 2, it's standard in HTTP 3, which is coming soon, basically in the next layer of transport protocols that we can expect, probably somewhere on the order of the next 5 years. So yeah, and so maybe some things to take note about in Cha-Cha 20 Poly 1305 is that we have this key stream, this stream cipher, that produces the, we create this key stream from our counters as we would expect, and so we create our ciphertext, and then we, after having our ciphertext, we use that ciphertext to create our authentication tag. So this is precisely an example of encrypting then authenticating. And just one last question before we kind of switch over to discussing some of the homework is a quick spot check. So this was one of the homework questions. The question is authenticate then encrypt, authenticate and encrypt, or encrypt then MAC. Or encrypt then authenticate. And the approach taken by both of the AEADs that we're discussing that we've just discussed, AES GCM mode and Poly 1305 or Cha-Cha 20 Poly 1305, both operate on a stream cipher that encrypts a message and then takes the MAC of that encrypted stream cipher output. So in both of those cases, encrypt then MAC is the sort of chosen direction. Now, zooming back into the homework for this week, so there are approaches or real protocols doing all of these things. So there is no ultimate everything that uses this one is wrong sort of answer here. But the answer that is maybe the most aggressive on your security, which is now basically standard because the security that we're talking about is like whether information can be inferred about the pre-image of your hash function. So when we take the authentication, there are two ways that you would break this, break a AEAD or an authenticated encryption. You'd either break the hash function by inferring information about the pre-image of the hash, thereby making the MAC weak, or alternatively, you would actually break the block cipher, and breaking the block cipher is also known to be kind of hard. So we kind of have this three-pronged approach. We can encrypt and authenticate, producing both the encryption of the message and the tag of the message. This is generally seen as the worst way to do things, but when you standardize an algorithm, sometimes the cost is larger to change from the standard than to just do something different. Authenticate and encrypt is, I think, used in SSH. At least that's, yeah. So I believe it's used in SSH. And the sort of cost to change the SSH algorithm in this sort of like very fundamental way would basically mean that all SSH connections, and this is obviously a fairly fundamental protocol for most interneting these days. To change SSH would basically break everything. So the question is like, is it actually worth standardizing a different algorithm than SSH that would be not backwards compatible? And the answer, I think, so far has been no. And then moving on to SSL and TLS. SSL and TLS do the authenticate then encrypt approach. And this is considered to be more secure if you're afraid about the security of your MAC. Like, for instance, if you thought that your MAC might actually leak information about your message, then you're opting for the more secure route to authenticate then encrypt. And then finally, we have encrypt then authenticate. Encrypting then authenticating is what more and more protocols are choosing nowadays. Since we know that we can actually design hash functions that are pre-image collision, or that leak no information about the pre-image of the hash function. So this is true of our authenticated encryption, or our authenticated encryption functions is that we do encrypt then authenticate, and this is becoming increasingly common. And we're not going to go over the second question because it's pretty straightforward. We're actually going to dive straight into looking at the questions here. Okay, so a question from the audience in YouTube. Why Rust Crypto didn't name AEAD methods seal and unseal like in some documents? Yeah, I don't know. I think they if you would post in the chat what they did name them. I don't have it right in front of me. And then looking at the chat in the main channel, yeah, okay, looks like we're doing just fine. Right, yeah, then we're going to move on here to some discussion of some topics that I think we want to handle over the next several weeks. So the first several weeks, the first 4 weeks or so, we're sort of trying to walk through several like core primitives that we are often using in cryptography, like hash functions and block ciphers and stream ciphers, authentication tags. But we're now going to shift attention just a little bit. In week 5 through 7, I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on how these things actually get implemented. And it's going to start with kind of a linked up. So the start here is basically that chapter eight's notes extend the book just a little bit. The book is maybe worth skimming, but I wouldn't say that there's very much of substance in it. It's a fairly high level take, and in some cases is sort of, it says like things like, oh, we just don't know how to write secure code, or we don't know how to write correct code. And ironically, the book, 12 years old at this point. Rust is fairly successful, and Rust is not the only language that is fairly successful at writing formally verifiable or provably correct code. So that statement is mostly out of date now. Now, the reading for this week and for the coming weeks around Christmas, if you choose to accept this mission, is largely sort of centered around common techniques that we use in Rust and in cryptography engineering to try to guarantee that we have things like constant time implementations and don't leak the secret information, or don't clone the secret information, or don't accidentally include the secret information in a debugging print statement, or a couple of other things. So there's several sort of techniques that are worth highlighting out of this week's reading and this week's notes. One of the things that I think that's most important out of this week's notes is, I guess just starting here. Good software practice in any language is good software practice in cryptography engineering +2 or ×2, whatever you want to say. So in general, like if the blocker on your if the blocker on your sort of like implementation is that you aren't familiar with certain primitives in Rust, the next few weeks should give you an opportunity to sort of practice those. And there are a couple of links towards the bottom here to help you gain familiarity. In particular, I think that one of the largest sticking points for newcomers to Rust is the memory model, borrowing and data on the heap and the stack. Basically, these links might be useful to you if you're still not feeling entirely comfortable with the Rust memory model. And the exercises may be updated throughout the Christmas holiday season, but I think this is a pretty good start for six exercises to start with. So kind of just to zoom in here to one of the resources. There are lots of ways that your implementations can potentially be problematic. And like they usually revolve around something failed in constant time. You branched based on secret data, so you should never have like a control flow that's based on some secret data that the adversary could determine information about your secret data, whether or not some control flow happened. So these three are all sort of like, okay, so we have several ways that secret data could potentially be used to make our implementations not constant time I guess. And then there's some other ones here that are more sort of like, okay, so your compiler might basically optimize away your constant time implementations and introduce these sort of secret branchings on your behalf. And in the actual latest release of Rust, I think this is Rust 1.66, we've actually gotten some new tools to prevent this. The historical answer for this, at least in Rust, has been to use attempts like the subtle library, which attempt to tell the compiler, don't optimize this. But in Rust 1.66, and if you've been following along with the homework and doing the benchmarking examples, you'll be entirely familiar with the black box primitive. Black box primitive is how we tell compiler not to optimize away whatever our implementation is. We would like to know how effective our implementation is for a benchmarking purpose. Well, we can actually now use this also in just native Rust code. So there are cases where you might want to use black box, and I haven't seen any blog posts to this effect, but effectively, or except for this one, I guess. Except for this one, the whole bit here is that I think black box is probably going to be a fairly standard tool reasonably quickly, and insofar as that it's now standard and stable Rust for preventing the compiler from optimizing away your sort of constant time attempts, right? And the compiler is tricky. It sees through you. It often is quite clever about knowing that you mean to do something not in constant time, but in optimistic, faster implementation speed. So that's kind of fighting the compiler is something that can be quite tricky. Especially if you aren't particularly familiar with reading assembly, as I am not. But you can usually do a little bit of inference that the compiler has fooled you, or you've failed to fool the compiler, more precisely. Moving back into this list, I mean, there's just like a couple of like very quick things to check off. When writing cryptography implementations, and usually it's worth leaving comments in your code if you have made decisions based on something like this list, avoiding constant time, or trying to center around constant time implementations, trying to avoid compiler optimizations, avoiding mixing security and abstraction levels in the same API layer is maybe a bit more of a software engineering sort of advice. And generally, oh shit, there's an echo in the stream? That's a bummer. Let's try moving this way the hell out here. Okay. I hope that fixed it. Okay, so typecast, oh yeah, there's just a couple of other things. So not lingering there too long. There's a couple of things to look at in this week's reading. The main things are generally intending to get to expose certain primitives in Rust, such that you have an opportunity to sort of like take these libraries and get some practice with them. The exercise also asks to get some practice with these primitives. So, yeah, I guess we're moving right along here. There are a couple of pretty standard tools when writing secure code in Rust. Zero Eyes and Secrecy are by the Rust Crypto Organization, and they're sort of well known as cryptography libraries in Rust. If you are writing any sort of like cryptography, you're almost certainly working with some degree of secret information. And this blog post sort of runs through what is at stake when you have these zero, or when you handle secret information. Secret information can stay in memory in persistent ways. It can live on in your in the worst case, it can live on in your long-term hard disk, but more likely you thought that you cleared your memory, but it still lives on in RAM or swap or somewhere in your cache, right? So Zero Eyes is this tool for zeroing out your memory in RAM, such that, and this is sort of getting into the direction of how do you prevent an adversary from obtaining secret information, even an adversary that doesn't compromise to your machine, that doesn't physically hold your machine in their hands. There are sometimes ways that an adversary can query your machine for arbitrary pieces of memory, even on a machine that's not fully compromised. And generally, when we're thinking about the like adversaries that we want to consider with our cryptography, like we can do encryption and decryption in a way that we want to basically say like the secure information is like only picked up as soon as it's needed and dropped as soon as it's not, so that the way that it is used is minimally under threat of being retrieved by an adversary. So secrecy and zero-wise are two libraries that you should definitely investigate. The homework includes some exercises for using them. And this blog post basically introduces the point that you can think that you dropped a value, that you implemented zero-wise on drop, but when you actually read memory and look at the memory in your machine, your memory might still contain your secret information, and a clever adversary might be able to actually take advantage of that. Moving right along. Suppose, what's another thing to talk about today? So there's really just kind of a kludge, a hodgepodge of links that I think are worth looking at for this week's homework. I suppose this week's might be somewhat of a shorter lecture. I haven't prepared quite as much in the way of sort of notes for this week. But I think we're going to close out here with a section for questions from the chat. Thank you, 364. And let's grab. Okay, I'm going to stick around here for any questions remaining before we sign out for today. It is a Christmassy day or a holidaysy day, wherever you may be. It's holiday season, so everyone's looking forward to taking 2 weeks to write Rust without meetings over the holidays, I assume.
That is all I'm going to be doing for the next 2 weeks is Rust writing, so for sure.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions personally. Someone said a slight echo that I don't hear, so hopefully it's not too big of an echo. Yeah.
Okay. Are there Rust libraries for hardware-specific crypto instruction sets? Not as far as I know. There might be, but usually the way I see that done is that usually there is a configuration feature branch where the compiled binary that you produce is feature gated based on whether or not a specific instruction set is detected by the compiler. This is why, or this is one way that you can sort of build for different operating systems. And there is actually a demonstration of feature gating your build, not specifically for instruction sets, but for malicious behavior. So the Axelar TFN library demonstrates a feature that I think is quite well done, in that the threat model in the Axelar TFN library is that you have several parties constructing a threshold signature, and one of them could be malicious. And so there's any of a number of ways that party could be malicious, but because they are already authenticated, since they hold a secret key share and they're a valid participant in the sequence, there are lots of ways that if you have a multi-party sort of cryptography algorithm where one of the parties could be malicious, it's really kind of interesting, and it's sometimes quite difficult to say, how would I simulate and test for malicious behavior on behalf of one of the users? So I think the point there with that particular piece of code is that you can actually do a fairly elegant thing here, in that you can use these feature branches to compile your code with an adversary that behaves in very specific ways, and test that your implementation does reject the adversarial behavior if you run it in coordination with, say, one adversary and several honest nodes. But as far as instruction sets, I would look up in particular, you should look at some of the Rust crypto implementations of hash functions and block ciphers, because block ciphers and hash functions tend to be highly acceleratable without too much loss to constant time implementation stuff. And some chipsets do accelerate hash functions. And in particular, AES is well known to have like a couple of techniques you can use to speed it up. So yeah, thanks for the question. And clicking over here, how does a client and server coordinate on a nonce? That's a good question, and I honestly am guessing here. But my guess would be that in the initial back and forth message, the nonce is probably decided on. The nonce itself is not important to keep. Well, it's worth keeping private. If it's cheap to keep it private, it's probably worth keeping the nonce private. But it's not. It shouldn't be lethal to your protocol if the nonce leaks, like if the key leaks. So what I would imagine is possibly true is that on the authenticated initial connection, the server sends the client back a nonce that they'll use, and then they can proceed using that nonce under a secure channel or an authenticated encrypted channel after they've done key exchange. So to wrap that all up in a ball, I don't know, but my guess is that the server chooses a nonce and tells the client, this is the nonce that we'll use when they're doing the TLS handshake. All right, I guess it seems like it's probably time to play the outro music. We did not cover TLS in too much depth. I wanted to expose that topic, not as something that's, I think, need to know it forwards and backwards, but since TLS is sort of one of the foundational internet libraries and is, usually the sort of the standard crypto library for a lot of projects, that whatever TLS is using, other cryptography is probably likely to use because TLS is probably going to be standard. It's worth knowing how TLS sort of works, and it's also a particularly good example when thinking about how a particular crypto primitive might be used, because for everything that we've covered so far, it all goes into TLS. And in particular, a handshake takes advantage of asymmetric encryption, asymmetric signatures, symmetric encryption, and authentication, symmetric authentication, just to construct a handshake. So it's basically a protocol that couldn't exist without like at least 4 different crypto primitives, and probably even leaving some out. Like I guess like we could call hash functions an additional crypto primitive. But when thinking about like how communication works, TLS, the TLS handshake is really something that could only exist with like a series of crypto primitives, which makes it a particularly good example, and also the code is usually pretty stable. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Outro music hitting out. Do 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 do. We don't have standard outro music. Do 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 do. We just talk about cryptography. Do 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 do. We don't have standard outro music. Do do do. Thanks for coming to cryptography with me and Chloe. Bye.
We appreciate you all. Thanks for coming, everyone.